are here on June 12th, 2025, and we're going to record a safety training. My name is Aaron Smith. I'm the lab supervisor, and I'm here with Sarah Kim, the histotech lead. And the purpose of this training is to keep the highest safety standards at SFVA. And also this training is required, or some parts of this training are required by the VA and other organizations like the Joint Commission. My goal here is to keep you, the audience, engaged for the whole session. And I know you have probably already taken very similar trainings, but again, in order to maintain the high standards, annual refresher for everyone seems like a good idea. The topics covered today are going to be general safety, fire and accidents, chemical hygiene, including hazardous materials and waste management, and then also ergonomics. Let's start out with some basic safety principles. Unintended accidents do sometimes happen, and this uncertainty is called risk, but everyone's shared goal should be an accident-free environment. Reducing the frequency and severity of workplace accidents is desirable, and well-informed people are key to successfully managing risks. If you take one thing away from this training, it should be feeling comfortable with the paradox that on the one hand, the goal is zero harm, but on the other hand, there are both risks and uncertainties at work. So you have to kind of hold both in your mind at the same time. General safety. Safety tip 1. Dangerous healthcare professional activities to avoid, just to name some. Needle stick injuries, exposure to infectious diseases, handling and disposal of sharps and other medical waste, risk of handling equipment that can cause injuries, such as cryostats, prolonged and intense activities, include sitting and standing and other ergonomic risks. It's worth noting that the sharps risk is the most likely injury in the pathology lab, but also that exposure to infectious diseases or harmful chemicals is also possible as a work hazard. Worker responsibility. That's you guys taking the training. Very important to know and follow plans and procedures, know how to identify and minimize risks, know the best actions to take when an incident occurs, and know how to report accidents. You should all feel comfortable at work asking questions and empowered by access to procedures. And hopefully there's a copy of our procedures available in the lab, and hopefully we've sent you guys all an electronic copy as well. Institutional responsibility. To the greatest degree possible, the medical center will provide all mechanical and physical facilities required for personal safety and health in keeping with the highest standards. And lastly, the regulator's responsibility is to establish a national minimum safety standard and implement these standards through guidance, engagement, and enforcement. So basically, the institution and our safety plan is trying to have establish the highest possible standards for this given environment. And the regulator's responsibility is to establish a minimal baseline for the whole nation through guidance, engagement, enforcement, such as inspections. Here's a list of some of the regulatory organizations. Some of these look familiar, like Joint Commission. I think a lot about the VHA directives that I have to follow. Emergency number at the VA is 22222. So if there's an emergency, you can call that number, and there's a switchboard on at our hospital, and the police will show up as first responders. The other number you can call is obviously 911, but I would suggest calling 22222 because they're more local and they'll have an easier time responding. Let's start with the fire safety plan now. We'll talk a little bit about the mechanics of fire. You have the fire triangle. Take any component away and the fire cannot survive. So this is a very basic overview of fire. If you have heat and fuel but no oxygen, you're not going to have a fire. You can have fuel and oxygen but no spark, you're still not going to have a fire. So just something to know about how it works. And obviously, if they're going to put a fire out, they're going to remove one of these components. And I'm back to the problem with this fire extinguisher thing. Okay. Let's just keep on going. You should know how to use a fire extinguisher. It's obviously better to use an actual fire extinguisher for training, but the second best thing is to know the acronym when you're using a fire extinguisher. Pull the pin, aim the nozzle, squeeze the handle, sweep from side to side. In the event of a fire, this RACE acronym is helpful. You want to rescue people, you want to alarm and let people know to evacuate, and you also want to contain and clear, close all doors and windows, contain the smoke. And so you want to make sure that you keep the smoke in the smoke compartment and contain the fire, and then either extinguish or evacuate. And if there's thick smoke, you probably want to evacuate. If it's a smaller than a wastebasket, then you should go get a fire extinguisher and try to put it out. There's different types of fire extinguishers. The one we use are A, B, C. There's different classifications of fire, A, B, C, and then D. But D is for metals that burn really hot, like magnesium, titanium, and sodium, and we don't use those. Fire extinguisher locations at our facility are in the hallway. There's one by the admin area here, and then the other one's right down by the lab. And the nearest fire pole to the lab is this is across the hall from our lab door. Another thing you should know is the evacuation route and the rally point, or the emergency assembly area, and it's located by the picnic benches by the cafeteria. This map shows our hallway and the 3 stairways to get out, and then it also shows this rally point, even though it's not related to where the building is further up to the east. Precautions for a fire. Do not try to extinguish fires that are larger than a wastebasket. Maintain smoke compartments and keep the fire doors closed. The fire doors have been designed for a reason and they're meant to contain the fire. Do not try to extinguish a fire involving hazardous materials, including cylinders of toxic gases, and leave the area. We don't have cylinders of toxic gases in the lab, but definitely evacuating is always an option. And avoid inhaling smoke or the fire extinguishing agent. And I showed you guys where the fire extinguishers are. Hopefully you guys can get a tour and familiarize yourself with where they are actually in real life. Talked about the assembly area and your evacuation. We conduct annual fire drills. Make sure you use the stairs and not the elevators in an emergency. And always make sure that the exit stairwells and corridors are clear, and to use the fire doors properly to contain the fire and smoke. Best way, okay. We're halfway done with the presentation, and I put this in here to emphasize that our goal here is to keep people safe and not blame individuals. Best way to tell the pathology lab supervisor that the lab's on fire. Ease them into it. Modesty is key if you start the fire. I don't want to make this weird, but we have a bit of a situation in the lab. The lab is in a slightly less splendid state than it was this morning. I was able to find the fire extinguisher, but do be a dear and help me pull this pin out. I hope you like my dry sense of humor. I'm trying to keep things interesting, but I do want you to take away that we're not blaming people for accidents. We're trying to prevent them and keep people safe. All right, are you ready for another weird safety joke? Best way to react when a resident tells you they chose pathology because they love working with very sharp knives. Keep a stiff upper lip and proceed with caution. React to nothing and pretend it never happened. That's great that you love pathology. I really love it too, but maybe not quite in the same way you do. Maybe it's better if we work on separate gross benches. You should always emphasize safety of yourself, and if something seems unusual to you, you should definitely take that into account. And if you have concerns or you feel uncomfortable or notice things that might be a safety concern, definitely bring it to my attention or pathologist's attention, and we'll take that very seriously. Next slide. Hazardous materials and waste in pathology. Hazardous materials exhibit one or more of the following properties. Formalin is toxic, and that's the main one that we use. But these are the other chemicals that we use as well. And so you should familiarize yourself with chemicals that you use often in our lab. You should also know some of the pictograms. A lot of these chemicals have these little pictures on them, and then some of them even have multiple pictures on there. So formalin is going to have the health hazard, going to have the exclamation mark, and it's also corrosive. The other thing you should familiarize yourself is this hazard identification diamond. You've probably seen these around. You may or may not know what they actually mean. Oftentimes in pathology, we use alcohols that are high on the fire hazard, and then there's other things that are a health hazard. Last thing for these toxic chemicals is that you should know that we have safety data sheets, and these are a wealth of information, and each safety data sheet has these different 13 sections. Here's the link if you want to access them at our facility. We also have a binder. The binder is right here. It's labeled MSTS, and then underneath it is the spill kit, and we also have the other thing you should know is we have the safety binder located in the workroom. All right, let's talk about formalin and cleaning up spills. Things do get spilled in pathology sometimes. Usually it's small because we're trying to work with a very small amount of formalin. But very important is determining what's actually spilled. And it could be water, it could be formalin, could be xylene. There's lots of things that could be spilled, but it's very useful to determine what's actually spilled early on. You should also notify people in the area so people are aware of it, and also so they can help you clean it up. If you let me know, I have a lot of capabilities to help clean up spills. We have spill kits. I can let EMS know to help us clean up with a mopping. We can contain the spill. We can notify emergency first responders, whatever we need to do. But the basic principle is dike, neutralize, contain the spill, and then make sure the area is ventilated because you don't want to expose yourself. And then we'll work together to clean up the spill. And also keep in mind there could be a fire hazard from any chemical spill. Okay, let's talk about PPE. We have this cute little picture of this guy with his different PPE and the different possible routes that can go into his body. I noticed when I was putting this PowerPoint together that he has eye protection in a lab coat, but he's not wearing gloves. So I'm wondering if he's really a real lab worker or if he's just a guy running around with a clipboard. But basically, the important thing is to use PPE properly and know the best way to use it. And PPE, personal protective equipment, limits exposure by ingestion, skin absorption, eye contact, inhalation, and wounds. And it does that usually by creating a barrier. And it's a last resort protection barrier, and it's only going to work if you properly use it, inspect it, and maintain it. And the reason we do that is to make sure the barrier remains intact and there's no holes. There's lots of PPE examples around in the lab, and then also in life, people use hard hats, and other construction workers use a lot of PPE. It's used a lot at work, and so it's pretty standard, and you guys should use PPE to protect yourself from getting hurt. When activities may involve direct contact or exposure to bloodborne pathogens or hazardous materials and chemicals, exposure to hot and cold, which we don't have that much in pathology, exposure to aerosolized particles, exposure to falling objects. You should use common sense to protect yourself from risks that are present. Other things to know about use of hazardous chemicals: check the chemicals before using them, make sure they're not expired, Make sure they're properly labeled, make sure the container is appropriate, make sure you're using in minimal quantities. That's a good way to protect yourself. That's built in with a lot of these smaller container sizes. And then dispose of chemicals via these three hazardous chemical routes. We have three in our lab, the general one that we put formalin through, and then special ones for acid and hazardous waste. Hazardous chemical labeling is important. Our procedures say that you have to make sure that chemicals are labeled with all these parts. Also important, if you're using decal or putting a specimen into chemicals, you should make sure you label the specimen properly as well, with the case number and a second identifier, ideally. All right, next safety tip: how to avoid dangerous recreational activities such as heliskiing, motorcycle racing, wingsuit flying, bungee jumping, and scuba diving. The best way to decline an invitation from a coworker is to make it sound like you've been swept up by fate itself. How terribly kind of you to invite me on your heliskiing trip. I must say jumping out of a helicopter sounds incredibly exciting, but I remembered I have something terribly important that day. Do tell me how it goes. It sounds like it will be a blast. It won't. Let me know next time you go. They won't. And I'll have a think. You probably won't. The reason I put this here is to remind you not to do things just because your coworkers think it's a good idea. Make sure you think for yourself and try to manage your own safety. All right, let's go back to our presentation now. We'll keep talking about the hazardous waste disposal. You have to make sure they're labeled correctly. Don't dump chemicals down the drain. That's very important. And then make sure you do dump them in the right container, especially with the decals, the acid, and then make sure the acetone, because that does have a strong smell. And we want to make sure it gets disposed of properly. All right, safety tip number 5. Best way to react when you see a resident trying to bisect a jawbone with a scalpel. Be firm, but don't hurt their feelings. I'm sorry to bother you, but I've noticed you're currently doing something very interesting with that teeny scalpel. That's one way to do it, but I'd be careful with that, as it's a bit much to use a small blade on hard bone. Do you think we could use a bone saw in the morgue? I'm putting this in because using the right tool for the job is so important. And it's very easy to hurt yourself when you're using the wrong tool. And hopefully you guys can help each other identify what the right tool is and use that instead of the wrong tool. All right, then we're in the final section of ergonomics. Ergonomics is a scientific study of people at work. The goal of ergonomics is to reduce stress and eliminate injuries and disorders associated with the overuse of muscles, bad posture, and repeated tasks. Specific risk factors are duration and repetition, intensity, forceful exertion, awkward postures, environmental factors, individual risks. And I want to add here that strategic breaks from intense tasks can be helpful. And so there's ergonomic risks in the lab, and there's also ergonomic risks in the office work. They're a little bit different, but I would say both have different forms of intense duration and repetition. And especially in the lab, there's a lot of there can be forceful exertion and awkward postures. So do try to make sure that you make your life easier by organizing your workspace, taking breaks, being smart about it rather than just pushing through it. So yeah, make sure you identify the risks and listen to your body. If it's hurting you, then maybe it's something that we can do a better job of making it easier. Last reminder, equipment safety. The cryostat blades are dangerous, and always be very careful when using cryostats. They do have a UV light component that gets turned on at night. So just be aware of that, and also be aware that needle stick injuries are a concern in the pathology lab. So make sure you're using the right tool and proper protection. We do have some cut gloves if you guys are interested in that, and maybe we can figure that out if you want that. And this is the last slide that summarizes everything we talked about. Hopefully after this presentation, you're going to be a good risk manager. Sharps risk, occupational risk of exposure to hazardous chemicals. You'll get to, hopefully you know where the eye wash is, and make sure that you, if your eye is exposed, you should wash your face for at least 15 minutes. There's also risk of fire and earthquakes. There's also risk of trips, slips, and other ergonomic risks. Hopefully you found this PowerPoint presentation useful. Feel free to reach out to myself or a pathologist with more if you have questions about this. And obviously we want to support you guys in the work that you do and make it safe. So don't hesitate to reach out. And thank you very much.